Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Man, we're so honored to be joined today by an amazing, awesome individual. This is Kristin Kobes Du Mez, and she is just going to blow your minds and knock your socks off. If you're not aware of who she is, number one, shame on you. Fix that. But I'm going to give you the quick bio that I ripped off of her website. So if there's anything wrong, Kristin, this is on you. But Kristin Kobes Du Mez is professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. Wow. And her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She has written for the Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, Christianity Today, The Daily Beast, and has been interviewed on NPR, CBS, and the BBC, among other outlets. Her most recent book is Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. And this is actually going to be released on paperback shortly. Is that correct, Kristin? Like a couple weeks?
Yes. Yep.
That's so exciting. And so we talked a little bit offline before. The new paperback version includes an updated preface that brings this right into the 2020 election cycle, right? And all that stuff that sadly played out kind of like we...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot happened in 2020, turns out. And so
it
takes
right?
us through, global pandemic, Black Lives Matter, a few antics of folks like Jerry Falwell Jr. and Eric Metaxas, and then through the 2020 election. So new preface, and the thesis is holding up alarmingly well.
Yeah. Sadly, as we mentioned before, right? We keep waiting for these folks to surprise us. And sadly, they just keep obliging us by being who we think they are.
Exactly.
So, it's sad. So I'm listening to the audio version of your book, and I'm compelled. I mean, it is just the level of detail and the research is evident. It's such a timely, needed, interesting book. So I just wanted to kind of jump off, if you would, maybe give us the Cliff Notes version of what is this book? What's it really dealing with primarily?
Yeah, it's essentially a history of white evangelical masculinity and militarism as they've been intertwined for the last more than half century, really, from the Cold War up through the present. And so it looks at evangelical teachings, looks at evangelical popular culture in particular, and looks at how certain ideals have been packaged and sold as biblical Christianity that I think you could argue at least might go against some core biblical teachings that really privilege power, privilege the assertion of power, and define Christian masculinity in ways that champion aggression, using violence to assert order and authority. And you can see this in the home, in the family, you can see this in churches, and you can see this in the nation. And so it really pulls this thread through looking at popular evangelical teachings on how to be a Christian man, how to be a Christian wife, how to raise your kids. And it connects them to what's going on in terms of American politics, in terms of American foreign policy from the Cold War through the Iraq War and really up to the present. And kind of the culmination is understanding how more recently evangelical support for somebody like Donald Trump should not be seen as a betrayal of evangelical values. Instead, in many ways, it's a fulfillment of these values of grasping for power and asserting authority, particularly white patriarchal authority.
Yeah. Wow. That's a lot. And you chewed off a lot in the book. And I'm so interested in that last little bit that you said when we see, because for me I don't use the word evangelical anymore. John doesn't even use the word Christian anymore, but I certainly don't use the word evangelical anymore. It's too charged. It's too, and even though in the best tradition of evangelicalism, I am that. Right? In the truest sense of the word, where evangelism is simply proclaiming good news. That's exactly what I feel like I do it all the time. But it's become so intertwined with a certain kind of politics that I just can't say it anymore. But how that begins to unravel a little bit. You mentioned Richard Nixon plays a pretty interesting role in this, where you have these characters that come along who though not very religious, right? Nixon's a Quaker. Ish, right? But a certain brand of Quaker that I didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
Militant Quakers, weird. Who knew there was such an animal,
thing.
right? The West Coast thing. So, but how that gives rise eventually to this sort of ultra pragmatic politician who says, listen, I don't believe any of this stuff, but for the sake of an election, I'll pander to a particular group. Right. Yeah. And I feel like I think that reaches its climax in a character like Donald Trump, who has no interest in religion whatsoever, but certainly doesn't mind riding on that horse. Yes. Right. Would you agree with that assessment? I mean, are those kind of, does one sort of piggyback off the other?
Yeah. You can kind of see the evolution of this. You could even start back with Eisenhower in the 1950s, right? Not quite the blatant contradiction, but certainly somebody who, saw that conservative evangelicalism could help him in his goals in getting elected and in achieving his policy agenda. And you can certainly trace that up through actually somebody like Barry Goldwater before Nixon, through Nixon, Ronald Reagan, right, all the way up, and certainly manifesting in somebody like Donald Trump. But again, to avoid kind of the idea of somehow this is hypocrisy or betrayal of values. I mean, on the surface, sure, but we have to understand that that kind of language sometimes suggests that there's something like a pure, unadulterated evangelicalism that exists throughout history. Right. And then sometimes it kind of runs afoul of, kind of political entanglements, but we can just extricate that pure evangelicalism. But that's not really how religion works. That's not how history works either. That, the evangelicals at the time understood their faith to be expressed in ways that aligned quite closely with, in the case of Nixon, with his foreign policy, with his domestic policy, with his views on race, with his views on militarism, right? All of these things. And so we shouldn't be thinking that there's this like beautiful evangelicalism that can easily be extricated from this. That evangelicalism was presented, it was preached, it was practiced in a way that was so thoroughly connected to these cultural values and these political views.
Wow. Yeah. And I think you're right. And I think we do labor under some delusion sometimes or maybe it's a naivete that says, hey, we can get back to that thing, and it reminds me so often of people, who sort of wax poetic about bygone days and say, well, man, in the good old days, this was this, life was this, and men were men, and, sound like Archie Bunker, and then if you dig a little tiny bit deeper, you realize, those good times weren't good for everybody.
Exactly.
So let's get back to the 50s when people knew their place. Is that what you mean? Right? Mm-hmm. Oh, because your power hadn't been challenged, right? Because your privilege hadn't even been addressed, let alone dealt with or recognized. So let's get back to those days when people knew to stay in their place and to shut up. And I just have to scream and yell, how that's not progress. How are we supposed to progress beyond any of this if we can't even see the roots of it in our own past? So what your book has done for me so far is starkly lay out, like, oh my gosh, this is actually not that hard to see.
Yes.
If you're willing to look. Like If you're just willing to open your eyes and go, and be honest for a second and say, holy crap. Yeah, we've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah, history is great for that, right? History, it just, here's the evidence. Here's what this person said. Here's what this person did. Here's a bunch of quotes, and then here's some more quotes. And just sit with this. Because evangelicals in particular have long controlled their own history, right? Have tended to tell their own stories, have tended to frame themselves in the best possible light, understandably so. We all do that. But evangelicals, I think in particular, right, evangelism is at the heart. So why would they want to kind of own up to some of the darker sides of the tradition, some of their own shortcomings? That's not the face you want to put forward, because who's going to want to convert into your tradition if you do that? And so evangelicals really have controlled their message, and they've done so through writing their own histories, writing their own popular histories, right? Having their own media empires. And so I think one of the reasons that this book is so jarring to many evangelicals who grew up in those spaces is, I mean, in the historical profession, this book is just, it's affirmed. It draws on secondary literature. I'm not kind of reinventing the wheel here. I'm drawing on the work of many other historians and just putting it together in a new way. But for many white evangelicals, this is like one shocking revelation after another, because although other people have known all this stuff, they have never encountered this. And that's something that has really struck me in the past year since this book released, just how shocking it is to evangelicals who on the one hand say, oh my gosh, this is the story of my life. Like I lived this. And on the other hand, somehow never understood what they were participating in.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it seems like, part of that reason is this media empire that they created, right? And so they put out their own version of this story, and it's almost to the point where like you're not allowed, you're not expected to reach out past their little empire. And I mean, that was another shocking part for me, was just this whole like how that even came to be, how it was created, I'll give them this, they're awesome marketers. They know how to market. Yeah, they know how to market a product and make you want to jump in, into the deep end. I mean, how do you even begin to explain how that even came to be? There was no one even seemed to question it. It just was it because it was kind of a slow burn?
Well, I mean, it wasn't exactly. It was very intentional, right? You can go back to 1942, the National Association of Evangelicals, and you read their founding documents and what they were talking about. They were very explicit. We want to kind of reassert our influence across this country, and we're going to do so through radio, and then eventually television, through Christian publishing, through having bookstores spread across the country, through networks and organizations and Christian magazines with subscribers in the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. Like they had these plans. And what is really remarkable is that they succeeded in a very short amount of time. Now, this is the post-war era. And so it was an economic boom. There were, the suburbs were springing up and businesses were popping up. And it was a time of general prosperity, particularly for white middle-class Americans. And so this was kind of the right time to be making these moves. Right. But it was also very much motivated by evangelistic purposes. And so there was a lot of kind of devout energy being put into this, but it was also commercial, right? There was also a lot of money to be made. And I think we have to hold those together. And one of the things I tried to do in this book is whenever possible, just make visible when money is changing hands, right? Book sales. You sell 4 million copies of a book. That's a lot of money. Right. You have, fundraisers for different organizations that are pulling in millions of dollars, by, these, in small donations and Christian radio. Think about, Christian radio, Christian TV, Christian publishing. All of these things are both to get the message out. Right. And that's really where the focus tends to be among evangelicals themselves. We want, to spread God's word. We want to spread these teachings, and it's all good and altruistic. But there's also the motivation of just making money. And for producers of this Christian popular culture, it is in their interest to make consumers afraid of quote unquote secular media, to tell them to stay away from, secular magazines. Don't get your news from Time or Newsweek. No. You have to come to Christian news sources. Don't watch secular movies. Go to the Christian film industry, and don't read secular books. We have Christian books. We have, in fact, come into this Christian bookstore. Everything will be safe and good. Now, again, there's a message there that they're getting out, but there's also a lot of money, and it's a wonderful way to kind of lock down your target consumer audience.
Yeah, it is. It's an astounding amount of money when I think about it. When my wife and I were first married, and we were sort of smack dab in the middle of all of this culture, the pressure to not participate or purchase or patronize anything other than these select groups. Like you went to Lifeway bookstore, man. You didn't go to Barnes and Noble to buy that book, right? We don't want to, we boycott Disney, because we had our own, for me, one of the most strange metamorphoses, if it even needs that, but is how we've handled the news media. Mm-hmm. And with the rise of Fox News and then even more right wing. More Fox's editorial stuff is 100%, a right wing parroting organization. They try to play, responsible news organization some of that way, but then there's other outlets that don't even pretend.
Yeah.
Right. But then for a very long time, it's very strange how just consuming the same diet of media can turn your own perceptions and thoughts. And so for a long time, it was all we did was watch Fox News. All we did was, shop at the Christian bookstore, and all we did was listen to Air One. And suddenly you're saturated with this constant drip, drip, drip of information that causes you to see the world in a weird way. One of the names you dropped is one that causes me to twitch, and it's not one of the ones you might think, but you dropped Eric Metaxas' name, and he makes me cringe. As a historian, does he bother you as much as he bothers me just as a human being?
Yes.
I mean, as a human being, I find him borderline repugnant. As a historian, is he every bit the hack I think he is?
Yes, he is.
Okay. Validation.
Right. No, I mean, he's fascinating. I remember my first kind of exposure years ago where I had, heard about his super popular Bonhoeffer biography. And this was before I was studying conservative evangelicalism. Right? I just, I was working on a book on Christian feminism, late 19th, early 20th century. So I just wasn't really engaged in this world the way I would be before long. And so I picked up that book, actually an audiobook, just to listen to, because I had heard great things. He's such a good writer, I'd heard. And I thought something totally outside of my field, right? I'm an American religious historian. My outside field long ago was in modern Germany. I lived in Germany for a time. So great, this will be a fun kind of exercise audiobook for me. And I started listening to it. And yes, very well written at first, very engaging. And about a third of the way in, it probably took me that long because I was only half paying attention. I suddenly thought, wait a minute. He's turning Bonhoeffer into a conservative American evangelical. I totally saw what he was doing. And I thought, I actually never even finished the book. At a certain point, I was like, I can't stomach this. And so, he's not, he's a powerful writer and a charismatic figure and a really bad historian. But he, for a long time, he played one really well. And that's where he's fascinating, right? He kind of can morph his identity in ways that are convincing, or at least have been convincing. So he was this Christian intellectual, Socrates in the city kind of thing. And he sold that really well with his pinstripe suits and all. And then to see him kind of take this leap into the full-on Trump support, right? That required some interesting challenges for him, I think, and I don't think he's entirely successfully pulled it off. But he's a fascinating figure and a very bad historian.
Yeah, I have multiple friends who've decided wisely, by the way, to investigate Bonhoeffer. I'm like, absolutely, and they'll show up with that book, and I want to smack it out of their hands. Just don't, please, dear God.
Read Charles Marsh.
Yeah,
Charles Marsh instead.
There's a biography written by one of Bonhoeffer's closest friends.
Yes.
Yeah, read that one. I will give him props because anybody who can take Bonhoeffer and turn him into a darling of right wing politics, that's a feat. You have to have worked pretty damn hard to cram Bonhoeffer into that box and make him somehow relevant to your cause. But I don't know, just, he bothers me more than a guy like Falwell. He bothers me more because he's masquerading as something that he's not. You know what I mean? Yeah. There is this veneer and this facade of intellectualism, and that kind of gives you the idea that he's going to be honest in his assessments. And meanwhile, there's an agenda. But anyway,
conservatives, they seem to take these people like this, and this idea comes up multiple times in your book, where these people who are not really true historians, not really true former Muslims, let's say that one, and they spin these people into their crusaders, right? Into crusaders of the faith. And even when we find out that it's all bullshit, that it's not true, they somehow spin it again.
Yes.
And continue to use these people that, for the most part, and from looking outside in, you're like, they're liars. They're not true. And somehow the conservative evangelicals can spin it in a way that they can continue to use these people not only kind of good, but really well. How in the hell do they do that?
That's actually a really great question because, I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, and certainly by the 90s, the real enemy, as far as I learned, was kind of postmodernism, right? Postmodernism and relativism, because Christians hold to the truth, and postmodernism means everything's relative, everything's up for grabs, but we are different. We have truth. And that's not what I found when I went back to research, right? That there is this us versus them mentality, which means the ends justifies the means in any case, because the enemy is always so real, so feared. So whether it's, Cold War communism or secular humanism or radical Islam or whatever the enemy du jour is, right? That will justify, in the case of foreign policy, preemptive war, right? You strike first because they're coming for you anyway, and you can't trust them. And so you have to act aggressively first. And that applies to domestic politics as well. And so it's this posture that develops. And what I will say is that the chapter I write on these fake ex-Muslim terrorists was really, fascinating and horrifying, but somewhere along the way, things clicked for me. Because back in 2016, with evangelical support for Trump, a lot of the media and many evangelicals themselves were kind of saying, well, you can't really blame them, right? Because evangelicals were just so afraid because the Obama administration and demographic decline and threats to their religious freedom. And they were kind of pushed into the arms of somebody like Donald Trump, right? Their fear led to this militancy. And what I came to see was that we needed to flip that script. Historically, more often than not, militancy led to fear. Because what I saw happening in the case of Jerry Falwell Sr.'s Thomas Road Baptist Church, Mark Driscoll's Mars Hill Church, the case of these ex-Muslim terrorists that were paraded across the evangelical speaking circuit, including long after their evangelical sponsors like Focus on the Family and CBN, and long after they knew that these guys were total frauds, right? Made me realize, wait a minute, the fear is real, but among ordinary evangelicals, that fear and acting out of that fear is real. But the fear does not emerge organically. It is manufactured. In more cases than not, it's manufactured by leaders themselves in order to sustain this militancy, in order to consolidate power for themselves, right? You make your followers so afraid. And so what do they owe you? Their loyalty. And you promise them protection. And that's what Jerry Falwell Sr. was after. That's what Mark Driscoll just perfected. And once that kind of clicked into place for me, I think this whole history kind of clicked into place. So rather than fear prompting militancy, more often than not, it was the militancy that required the continual stoking of fear. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems so obvious to me, that it's such a self-serving, right? If the profit motive can't be ignored, by the way, cannot ignore the profit motive. In order to keep people interested and engaged, they've got to continually be afraid.
Yeah. And they need your donations. They need your time. They need your energy, and they need your loyalty. Yeah. So if you've got problems with them, just shut your mouth, because we've got bigger worries over here. So your absolute loyalty.
And then, so piggybacking off of that sort of overused phrase, toxic masculinity, but a thing, right? That begins to be manufactured, this idea of a John Wayne mentality. Without that, there is no Mark Driscoll, I don't think. Mark Driscoll is the love child of John Wayne and whatever right-wing groups he spawned. And we get a Mark Driscoll who says stuff like, I can't worship a Jesus I can beat up.
Exactly.
Right. And so now masculinity is defined as not just strength, but strength in the advancement of your goals through violence.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
So now Jesus is, he might have been meek and mild the first time around, but when he comes back, boy, is he pissed. Right. If you're Mike Bickle at IHOP, another nut job, who says that literally Jesus will wade in the blood of his enemies, you have got to be completely divorced from any foundational truths about Jesus at that point to claim that, right? Yeah. But how does that, do you see that as sort of an organic evolution, or do you see that as more nefarious? As though, no, this has been intentional all along. We're pushing ourselves towards an agenda.
Oh yeah, nefarious. Yeah. So, it's calculated. It happens over time. There's, agency asserted by many leaders and pastors and writers over time. And it is this kind of John Wayne mentality. And the reason I went with that for a title, or one of the reasons, is because it just kind of encapsulates what's happening here, which is Christians, self-professed Bible-believing Christians going outside of the scriptures, really, for their models of Christian manhood. What first tipped me off to this was reading John Eldridge's Wild at Heart in the early 2000s, right? Where I thought, wait a minute, this is, these Bible-believing evangelicals. Well, you read that book and there's not a lot of scripture in that book. And so Eldridge is looking to Hollywood heroes, mythical warriors and cowboys and soldiers, and especially Mel Gibson's William Wallace from the movie Braveheart, right, is his model of Christian masculinity. Just like, earlier and subsequently again, many Christians have looked to this John Wayne masculinity as the model of Christian manhood. And what's happening here, I came to see, was, these are men who are not formed by traditional Christian virtue. We can throw Donald Trump into this mix, which might be obvious as well. All right. So Christians looking for, kind of icons of masculinity outside of Christian tradition. And paradoxically, it's men like John Wayne who are better suited to lead Christians and to lead America in this moment. Again, this moment stretches through recent history across the decades because of whatever the current threat is. And so somebody like John Wayne was not constrained by traditional Christian virtue. He was not afraid to do what needed to be done, to use violence to achieve order, right, on screen and in some cases off screen in terms of his politics. And that's this model that we see repeated, that what is most kind of attractive in a leader is precisely the leader who has not been shaped by, say, the Beatitudes, the fruit of the Spirit. That's not what this moment calls for. And so that's really the corrupted of faith part of the subtitle, right?
Yeah.
That you go outside of Christianity for your model of Christian manhood. Ultimately, you have to shape your Christianity to align with that. And you have to transform the Jesus of the Gospels into, like Mark Driscoll says, this warrior with a tattoo down his leg who's, riding a horse, wielding a bloody sword and charging into battle. That becomes your Jesus of the Gospels, which is an utter distortion of the historic Christian faith.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's I remember diving headlong into Eldridge's book when I was, a young evangelical and thinking, yes, this is great. And we had Bible studies. We did this thing. Some of the stuff is hard to talk about because it's so absurd, right? From this vantage point, looking back, it's like, holy shit. Like,
what did you do? You gotta tell your stories.
But we had this men's group that rose up out of Wild at Heart. And so this guy that I was, serving in a church with, we decided that for 6 weeks or 8 weeks, however long it did, we would meet. This was a father and son thing. So guys, bring your boys. We talked about a chapter of the book, and then we did something manly. Like we went out and shot stuff, or we went out and blew stuff up, or we zip lined through the sanctuary, or we did manly things. We, drove ATVs out on the church property. And I remember, at some point I flipped a switch. Eldridge, that book is fine. It's whatever. I didn't think it was particularly, it's not particularly horrifying. It's so banal now anyway. But I just got disillusioned with the whole notion of some sort of prescribed masculinity that had to be manifested, had to be expressed in all this physical stuff. Like men are physical, women are this. And I'm like, you're creating these false divisions, this dualistic thought that just doesn't even bear out anything. It's not scriptural. I mean, there's nothing. There's nothing. Anyway, it is Wild at Heart. Gosh, wait, I could talk to you for so long because there's so many tendrils of this that begin to worm their way into everything, right?
Yeah.
So these notions of masculinity, which obviously then completely corrupts and distorts the way that we view women and their role inside the church or outside the church or just in society at large. So what are the, I mean, besides the obvious, what the negative effects of this kind of masculinity as expressed in a guy like John Wayne and how that manifests itself among women? I mean,
one of the problems here is that this does end up kind of separating Christian virtue into masculine and feminine categories. So men are called to be courageous. Men are called to, be brave and strong. And women, they get the kindness and the gentleness and the self-control and all of those things. And we've talked about how that ends up, corrupting Christianity itself. But then what does that look like for women who, for them to be faithful is to be submissive. Yeah. It's also to be beautiful. All right. So we could talk about, the other part of Eldridge's equation, which is every man has a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue. Okay, right. So women, your role, you got to be beautiful. You have to be seductive. That's his words too. And you need to, be rescued by a heroic man. And it wasn't Eldridge who came up with this either, right? As a historian, I went back and saw deeply problematic views of gender and sexuality permeating conservative evangelical culture, right? I read sex manuals from the 1960s and 1970s, and they really are disturbing, where, this idea of men are aggressive and they're filled with testosterone and they're called to be leaders. And that applies in the bedroom as well. Women are called to be submissive and to, meet all their husband's needs. Well, that applies in the bedroom as well. And it sets up this really toxic understanding of sexuality where boys will be boys, right? I mean, ideally, you show some restraint, but hey, it's hard. We get that. So it's on women to protect social morality, to protect morality, right? So women who are not married have to be very modest, have to never tempt a man who is not their husband. And women who are married have to fulfill their husband's every sexual need. And there are many. Again, this is just the way God made everything. And so what we see the fruits of that most horrifically worked out in cases of abuse, where over and over again, we see victim blaming, even if the victim is a young child. And so, what did you do to seduce this man? And often the wife gets blamed too, because clearly you were not meeting all of your husband's sexual needs that he had to go outside of marriage. And so it sets up these ideals. Women have to be submissive. They have to be sexy. They have to be beautiful. They have to be enticing, all of these things within the bounds of heterosexual marriage. And if there's ever a problem, sexual misconduct, abuse, right, it's clearly a woman is to blame, or many women are to blame. And this sounds horrible, and it is horrible. And it was shocking, honestly, to see this pattern repeated over and over again in writing and in practice.
Yeah. Well, and sadly, that's in the mainstream evangelical church, everything you just said is either explicitly or implicitly said all the time, right? There's all kinds of rules, and either written or unwritten, about how women are supposed to dress. And I find that insulting as fuck. Can I say that, John?
Yeah.
Because what? I'm a man. I have no control over, I see an attractive woman scantily clad, and I've got no control. I'm just going to have to go do something. And I'm like, that's horseshit. That's absolutely so. Why? So it's demeaning to women. It's just as demeaning, well, at least slightly demeaning to men, because it assumes we have no control, and so everything is now triggered by somebody's visual acuity. It suddenly triggers my animal instincts, and I'm like so offended by that. It makes me drop F-bombs on a church podcast. What the hell is going on, John? We just lost 2 of our 5 viewers.
Oh, dang
We're so screwed, man.
But I mean, doesn't it also just it creates this environment where it seems like we're picking on a group of people, and you know what, we are. The evangelical Western evangelical church then is required to protect these abusers.
Yes.
Oh my God. Don't get me started there.
Because aren't we all, and I can say we because for the first 18 years of my life, I was in this before I left, but aren't we all supposed to just forgive? Aren't we all supposed to give everybody a second chance, a third chance, a fourth chance, a fifth chance? I mean, so we create this culture that one says you need to be, as a woman, you need to be pure. You need to be pretty. You better learn to cook. You better be able to handle a couple slaps across the face without really complaining much, right? If not that, a lot of verbal abuse, and you just need to suck it up. And then then we can go down the whole racism side of this, which, every single person that they have put up in place, like a John Wayne, like a Nixon, like all these, they're John Wayne, they're super masculine men, are fucking bigot racists. And I'm sorry, I'm not getting mad.
No, see, you got him fired up.
Jump in here and let me see if I can. So
temper this somewhat because we're off the rails.
Calm us down a little bit.
I grew up in I had a good Christian upbringing too, and so I have very clean language, except in chapter titles in this book.
Yeah, I did love that, by the way.
Their words, not mine.
Your chapter titles are great.
But the idea of forgiveness, yes, this Christian rhetoric to paper over, just really unchristian or just immoral teachings and practices is what we're talking about here.
Right.
And so much has been done. Horrible things have been done and then covered up repeatedly in the name of protecting the witness of the church. Right. That's something I come to in the last chapter, and I talk about abuse in particular, but it's true more broadly as well. That I quote Rachel Denhollander in that last chapter. She was the first witness in the Larry Nassar case to expose the abuse of this doctor in terms of USA Gymnastics and Michigan State.
Yeah.
And she has a very powerful victim statement. But she also, in that moment, came out and addressed abuse in evangelical circles. And she herself is a conservative evangelical woman. But she said, hey, evangelicals, we need to address this too. And evangelicals were much more supportive of her going up against Larry Nassar than they were calling out in her own communities. In fact, she and her husband ended up having to leave their church over this. And she has this really powerful quote where she talks about running up against this language of protecting the witness of the church, protecting the mission, right? And this is over and over again. Like, let's hide our the problems. Let's hide the abuses. Let's hide whatever's going on because we don't want to destroy this man's ministry, or we don't want to destroy the witness of this church. And she says she says Jesus Christ does not need your protection.
Yeah.
Right? Jesus only asks for obedience. And what does that look like? It looks like telling the truth and doing justice. And that's it. And I think that honestly is the moral center of my book too.
Yeah.
And you talked about, we're saying some harsh things about a group, white evangelicals. In the book, I try to kind of break that down and be as nuanced as I can. But yes, we are saying some harsh things about white evangelicalism as a culture and looking at these patterns. And what I will say is many white evangelicals have actually embraced this to their credit. I have been shocked. The book released almost a year ago now, and white evangelicals have been its most ardent defenders, consumers, right? They are buying this book. They are reading it. They are having adult Sunday school sessions on it. Pastors are reading it in their groups, book clubs. It's really remarkable because many white evangelicals are seeing, yes, this is not like 100% who we are. And we are, all of us can't be defined by this, but almost all of these evangelical or former evangelical readers have stories to tell. They have bumped up against this in so many ways, and they have experienced it, and many are acknowledging that they have been complicit in this.
Yeah.
And so I'm really, I want to say some nice words here too about evangelicals, in that thousands of evangelical readers have actually embraced this book with remarkable humility and in the spirit of owning their own complicity and working for change. And that's something I did not anticipate when I published this book.
Yeah. That's heartening. That's encouraging. I live in Texas, and in particular, I live in West Texas. We have our own particular brand of what all of this means, and it's a weird culture to be a pastor in and try to push back on a little bit and say, I know this is the way you're raised. I know this is the way you think, but let's challenge that for a second. Could we just, take off this mindset for a second, set it aside, and let's objectively try to look at some of this stuff. I was never more frustrated with my white evangelical brothers and sisters as I had been during the Trump years. And I remember one of the, he's an easy target. So it almost feels like whack-a-mole just to go after him. But when he was first running, I was very open in my criticism, because most people were. There was a handful of people who either prophetically or fortunately, however you want to say, I'm not sure if they lucked into it, or if they knew, but who from the start were very much like, no, this is our guy. This is our guy. There were a whole lot more who voted with their nose pinched and held their nose and did it anyway. But so I had the ability to be very honest. I'm like, so I wrote several Facebook posts about, listen, dear evangelicals, stop being bamboozled by this guy. He doesn't care about you. He doesn't believe what you believe. He is simply pandering. And I got a lot of amens and, oh yeah, he's terrible. He's terrible. He's terrible. And we hate him. And then an occasional, I'm talking hundreds of comments of support. And then he got elected. And those very same people were the ones who blocked and unfriended and told me to go shut up. And, it was weird how quickly that whole thing turned. And now, instead of tolerating this guy and holding him accountable, like, hey, we've elected him, we still have to hold him accountable. Let's make sure he does what he's supposed to do. It was adulation, 100% borderline idolatry. I'm not even sure borderline. I think it's just idolatry that couldn't question. And I'm nervous, to be honest with you, Kristin. I'm nervous about what that means for evangelicalism as it continues, because I don't see them having repented of any of that.
That is true. I will say that, in the responses I get, because I've heard from so many hundreds of readers, and I get letters every day, I'm well aware that, this is still the minority movement, right? The majority
100%, yeah.
are still. And so while I've been really heartened at the humility with which many evangelicals are receiving this book, those are the ones who are going to be reading a book with this subtitle, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, right? So this is a subset we're talking about. Yeah. In fact, there's a lot of talk in the media right now about this evangelical reckoning, right? And I when I'm asked by journalists, I say, yes, it is real. It is very real on a personal level, on an individual level, right? There are tens of thousands, probably way more than that. No, I'm sure there's way more, right? Evangelicals who are quote unquote deconstructing right now. They're doing exactly what you're saying. Like, let's just take this ideology, take these values, and then let's look at the Bible and let's see, where do they align and where are there some disconnects, right? That's the deconstruction that I'm seeing happening in many spaces, not a deconstructing and walking away from the faith entirely, although, there is some of that. But most of what I'm seeing is this, let's revitalize our faith. Let's realign once again and to see what here is cultural baggage and what is, the word of God here. But those are minority voices. Yeah. And what I see happening time and again is, when they speak out, so on Facebook or in their churches or in their Christian schools, things often don't go well for them. Yeah. And so ultimately they end up either deciding to go quiet again, it just wasn't worth it, or to just walk away. Again, not from their faith, but somebody like Beth Moore is a great example on the national stage of try to fix from within, try to challenge, and ultimately say, I guess this isn't my home anymore. Walk away from the church, from that particular church, from this Christian school. I know pastors who've gotten fired, pastors who've just given up in despair. And that's what I'm seeing across evangelicalism right now, this individual reckoning, but by and large, the institutions are holding firm and the status quo persists.
Yeah. No, I see the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like, and like you say, we're going back 50 years, and this is just a culmination of all of this. And it almost feels like, unfortunately, that we were just building up to this moment for the election of this president, that the evangelical church was kind of prepping their flock to be able to accept this bombastic, amoral asshole, and then to just drink the Kool-Aid, right? And then just jump in to the deep end, 100%. Whatever he says is gospel truth. We aren't going to question him. We had 4 years of just like, this guy is lying. He's lying. We can show you with facts. And they're like, no, fake news. Everything he says is absolutely true. Oh my God. And we just, it builds off of misogyny, racism, all of that, to the point where we have two major things happen, obviously. And like you said, you talk about this in your kind of updated version of the book, is you end up with COVID and you end up with the storming of the Capitol, right? And I think neither one of those things happened.
I turned the manuscript in just before the storming of the Capitol, but that really is the culmination here. Right. That's what we're still in that moment really today, right? There's no justice. There's no reckoning there within the Republican Party or frankly within conservative evangelicalism. So that's where we are. And you're right. History is does not give us a lot of hope here. I mean, when I first started to write this book, I started this just after Trump's election, pulling some early research that I had done years before. But it was the fall of 2016 that this really crystallized. I thought, yes, I have to write this book and I have to write it now. And so I wrote it, and it was all very rushed to get it out in plenty of time for the 2020 election. And at a certain point, when we were just about ready to kind of throw it into production, done, my editor emailed me and said, so Kristin, this book is really depressing. And you can't leave your readers here. Like you just can't, you can't do this to them. And this was, not a Christian publisher, this wasn't like a spiritual thing. This was just like, you can't do this to people. Like you got to give your readers something to hold on to. And so I really thought about it, because honestly, I was really depressed. It feels like you said this, like culmination, right? Like that we're just being drawn, and this is the logical, almost feels inevitable conclusion. And as a historian, I can say, right, nothing is inevitable. You have to give agency. You have to leave space for paths not taken. But boy, did it feel like, of course, this is where we are. And so I wrote him and my editor, and I said, I'm as depressed as you are, and I've got nothing. I'd have to make something up. I don't know what to give you. And he said, okay, I respect that. And then about 2 days later, he writes again. He's like, Kristin, just give us something. And so that's when I gave him the last line of the book, right? What was once done might also be undone. And honestly, at the time, I was so embarrassed to send that. I'm like, this is so feeble. And he's like, I'll take it. Yeah. And we went with it, went into production, but that sentence, there is truth there, right? There is truth. Right. And I've seen that now in all of these letters that I get, that people who were complicit in this, people who were all in, including, I've heard from evangelical leaders who played some pretty key roles here, and who are now confronting precisely what it is that they have done, what they've contributed to. And history lets them see that. And history lets ordinary evangelicals understand that all of these moments in their life, they were in this book group. They did these Wild at Heart retreats. They did this, they did that. They voted for Reagan. They, like fill in the blanks. All these books I talk about, I literally have readers send me photographs of their bookshelves that have all these books on it, right? They send me letters that have paragraph by paragraph their life story as it tracks through the chapters of this book, right? Wow. So that's the level of connection here that they have to confront. But history helps them to see exactly what it was that they were participating in, and that is absolutely critical if you do want to start undoing this, right? Yeah. Seeing how this came to be, this was not inevitable, right? Choices were made at various times sometimes usually by leaders to enhance their own power, right? And you can, when you can see how we got to this point, you can say, you know what? Maybe this isn't God ordained. Maybe these gender roles are not, eternal throughout all of time. Maybe maybe Christian orthodoxy doesn't look exactly like this. And if you can get to that space, then we can start having conversations. Then we can start moving forward and start unraveling some of this. So I think there is truth to it, even though, yes, the book is still pretty depressing.
I don't think that's an inappropriate place to be, especially as we left that 4-year of that president. Anyone sane was depressed. I've lived through the Reagan era where we thought we were going to be nuclear bombs were going to be flying at us at any moment, right? We all watched The Day After. We saw those movies, right? Yeah. We knew that there was a guy on the other side of this planet with his finger on the button, just waiting to annihilate us, right? And I lived in fear, and I lived in more fear the last 4 years. I have never lived through more fear of where this country was going than 2016 to 2020. I was lost. I was scared. And I was shocked at how complacent the church was in all of this and how easily they backed him. And
sold their soul.
Yeah. And I honestly thought, okay, he's got something on him. It's got to be. And when he's voted out, they're all going to stand up and they're going to say, hey, now that he's gone, here, let me tell you the truth. And not a single one really is. I mean, there's a few out there who have said some small little, pieces of what maybe was really going on. But for the most part, they see that their potential in any future politics is still riding the Trump train. And they can't leave it. Yeah. And so, unfortunately, what is that? As I'm not asking you to be prophetic on this, but you were pretty prophetic on your book. So, what does that lead us to for like the midterm elections and then the 2024 elections? I mean, what do we have to do to kind of help wake up the nation, or can we?
Yeah, I don't think much of the nation really wants to wake up to this. And that's the problem. For me as a historian, I will say the most shocking thing about the last 4 years has been the real and present danger to American democracy, to democratic norms and institutions. That caught me off guard. I thought that there was more resiliency there. And so what I am most concerned about, well, many, many things, but, things like voter suppression, that, wait just a minute. And I should know this from my research, right? Particularly in terms of conservative evangelicals, there is this tendency to say, America is a Christian nation. So this is who you want to be running this nation, people who defend our version of Christian America, which is, us. And so why would you want to give power to people who don't have access to God's truth? And right there, I think that's one of the things that did surprise me also in the research for this book, the authoritarian tendencies that are just loud and clear within conservative evangelical teachings. Growing up I've said this before in an interview, and there was a secular reporter I was talking with, and they said, by secular, just not having grown up in evangelical spaces, and they, from the outside, they're like, really? That surprised you? Wasn't it kind of obvious? I was like, no, you know what? From the inside, I somehow grew up thinking that this Christian patriotism meant a respect for democratic norms and institutions. I thought, I was hearing this and thinking, this means yay for the civil rights movement. This means good, to protect voting, because ultimately that is what it means to be patriotic, because that's what I thought it meant to be patriotic. And so really bumping up against just how authoritarian these teachings of hierarchy, of authority, of who gets authority, who does not, were jarring for me in my research. Even so, seeing this played out on the national stage for the past 4+ years, I continue to be kind of shocked by this, that things that I took for granted, I'm in my 40s, I'm a U.S. historian, and I kind of thought I knew where we were at generally as a country. And I think that so many of us just have to, it was day in, day out, recalibrating, like, okay, wait a minute. Okay, so nope, the next day it just got worse. And that's really what the last 4 years have felt like. And certainly January 6th. And again, we're still in that space. We're still in that January 6th moment, really. There has not been any sort of reckoning or reconciliation. And so I don't know what that looks like for the midterms or for 2024. But right now, I'm not seeing any change within the Republican Party. Right? If anything, it's becoming more radicalized. And, evangelicals are a key part of that. Yeah.
And they've just stripped one of the few voices of reason in their party of all her power and said, how dare you step outside or color outside the lines. And I'm not really a big fan of Liz Cheney, but good on her for, for sacrificing, knowing full well what was going to come, that she still stood her ground and spoke her truth. There are so precious few of them who will.
There are, Justin Amash before her, same thing.
Well, it started to really piss me off because it seemed like the occasional voice would come out and start to speak out as they were exiting. Yes. Well, that's not brave. No. I'm not running for re-election. Now, let me tell you what I think. Or I'm not seeking another cabinet position. So let me tell you what I think. Well, it doesn't take any courage whatsoever to criticize as you're leaving the building. I'm looking for those handful of voices who will stand up. The one thing that I thought was interesting that you just one of the things that I shouldn't say the one thing. One of the things that was interesting. I've been inside of the church structure, my whole life, and I'm writing a book about that experience right now. So, watch out for people. No, I'm just kidding. But one of the things I just wrote a couple of days ago was, as I'm writing some of this, and it's even like as I'm telling you the story of the John Eldridge, there are things that are kind of embarrassing to say, because the pattern of submitting myself to authoritarian people who neither deserved or would respect my loyalty is so painfully obvious now. Yeah. But that's how indoctrination works. Yes. You don't see it from the inside. No. It's hard to see from the inside. You really have to step outside that space. Yeah. And I feel like that's true across the board. Yes. Like whatever system of indoctrination is being used, it's effective. They do it because it's effective. Yeah. And so in order to get people or for people to see things differently, it has to be, an act of the will that says, okay, I choose to try and see this differently. And sadly, I don't see that will.
No, I think you're absolutely right. This deference to authority has been actively inculcated for generations now, and with some really horrific effects. And we can see that, in the book I trace out in cases of abuse, but just more broadly within this evangelical culture. And so one of the decisions that I made in this book as I was writing, it just this is the way the words came out, but then it was an intentional choice to leave them as they were, was an absolute refusal to show deference to these evangelical authorities. And so you can tell that right from the cover of the book, right? Title, subtitle, the tone of the book. I thought, too often voices of protest have been stifled or really, really kind of softened or muzzled. There's so much of this language like, oh, come on, this is my brother in Christ and I affirm so much. And just this little thing, but never mind. This really treating leaders as somehow beyond reproach. And this, like, as you're saying this, this was taught to you and it was taught as a virtue. Yeah, right? Exactly. Showing deference to authority is how you are a faithful man, how you are a faithful Christian. But look where that has got us today. Yeah. Right. It was so many cases where evangelicals keep their mouths shut. So many. I know because I'm hearing from them. I'm hearing from people who still, there are people who try to tweet about this book and are disciplined by their religious authorities. There are people who don't dare to post about it on Facebook because they know they are going to be dragged, right? Yeah. And then there are people who do it anyway and pay prices, including losing jobs. And I just think, where the Christians are supposed to be about telling truth, right? Truth is kind of at the center of things here.
We thought so.
but no, it's so much pressure. I mean, I've been told so many times, like, you are so brave, Kristin, because you named names in this book, which I'm a historian. I don't know how you write history without naming names, right? This is just what we do. But why in this space is that seen like such a bold thing to do? Because we haven't been doing that for too long. Too many Christians have been afraid to speak the truth.
Yeah. We're really good at pointing out other people's issues, right? I mean, we're really good at pointing out the Nazis and how horrific they were towards the Jews, right? But, God forbid we in America talk about what we did to the African American culture, to the indigenous culture, to women, to the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, God forbid we actually point the finger back at ourselves and say, hey, we are the issue here. We're really good at pointing the finger at someone else, saying you're the issue. But we when it's asked to be pointed back at us, we just have absolutely no ability to do that. And the church, unfortunately, has shown us how to not do that. And they are very, very good at it.
Which is crazy, right? I grew up in a conservative church in the Christian Reformed tradition, and we had a liturgy, and literally every Sunday, we went through several minutes of, confession of sins. And there was always a song that went along with confessing our sins. And then there was a silent prayer in which we privately confessed our sins, and then a communal prayer in which we confessed our sins and then had some assurance of forgiveness. But that was a big part of Sunday morning every single week, acknowledging our shortcomings individually and collectively. Yeah. And so again, I'm a Calvinist. I'm coming from that space, and it's just kind of baffling that, as you say, so many evangelicals, including many Calvinists, have somehow this huge problem of acknowledging our shortcomings. Yeah. And you know what? Yeah, we did do some things wrong. We continue to do things wrong. Give us humility and just, and help us do better. That now has almost become politicized. That if you're self-critical of America, if you're self-critical of kind of white privilege, white supremacy, if you're self-critical of Christianity, any of this, that becomes is so easily demonized and politicized in such a way that you can't even talk about these things anymore. And that really does, I think, it's a corrupting influence on what it is to be a Christian and on faithful Christian practice and witness.
Yeah. It seems like the new virtue is not being willing to confess your sins, but to be in complete denial of them. Yeah. And that's it's sad. It is sad. I do. I applaud your efforts. I think your book is a must read for those who would. I mean, I think the more that you viscerally react to the title, probably the more you should read this. Like that might be a barometer of how much you need this. If it really, because I've been on church staffs, and I finally had to plant my own church to get to a place where I could say what I wanted to without getting dragged through the mud by whatever religious authorities I might be under. And I just don't buy it anymore. Even the notion of religious authority just strikes me as antithetical to the teachings of Christ anyway. So, but I love what you did with this book. I confess I haven't read all of it. I'm trying to get through it, but I want to digest it, and I don't want to just blow through it to get through it. So, I wouldn't say I'm enjoying it. It's hard to say. It's a tough, I don't mean that. I think you know what I mean, right? It's a necessary read. It's a really good read. It's well written. It's obviously well researched. The academic acumen behind it is top notch, stellar. But there are some difficult truths that need to be confronted, and some difficult truths that need to be wrestled with.
I hear that a lot, actually. Some people read it all, in a weekend, and they say, oh, it's such a page turner. But I hear from a lot of people for whom this hits really close to home. They have to take it a chapter at a time, bite-sized pieces. They might have to set it aside for a time. And what I hear from so many people is it really helps to read this in community, right? To have somebody or many people to kind of bounce your own experiences off of, to process together. And so, hopefully people who sense that need are able to find those communities to kind of wrestle with this.
Yeah, and I think 100% agree that would be a really good way to to deal with this book would be in community, where we could say, all right, hey, chapter 1, let's wrestle with this a little bit. Let's talk about it. And let me have it. What made you mad? And that, because really what has to happen is you have to be pissed off a little bit. And then let's find out why. Right. Like, why did that bother you? Oh, you know what? Exactly. It bothered me because I resonate with that, or it sounds like me and I don't want to really. So I think it's really good if so this episode will actually release very close to the timing of the release of the paperback. I'm assuming it's available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. The Audible version is out. Yeah. Obviously, John and I both can't recommend it highly enough. I recommend just get it. Follow Kristin on Facebook. Go to her website. I would say just get a hold of all of it. Your voice is necessary, and it's very, very helpful at this time. So, dear evangelicals, listen. Please, dear God, for the sake of all that is holy, listen to the voices who are saying we can do better, that we can be more faithful to the call of Christ in the way that we deal with each other. So I appreciate you so much being here. I could talk to you for another hour easily. There's so much more that we've left on the table, but man, I just have really, really appreciated your willingness to come on and talk about this fantastic book.
Oh, thank you so much.
Amen. All right. Well, we are signing off.
Yeah.
And we are John and Nat, and this has not been church. So even though it feels like it kind of has been. So
all right.
We appreciate you guys. We'll catch you on the flip.
All right.
Peace.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.